NVIDIA's Kepler architecture was launched in 2012 and was a top performer for DX11 titles, with the flagship GTX 680 claiming the title of world's fastest single GPU. But times have changed, and so has technology. Kepler-based cards are now no longer supported by NVIDIA and lack DX12 hardware support, meaning they can't run many of today's games. Here's a list of some of the games I couldn't run on the GTX 660 Ti. Kepler-based cards also have an issue with any version of AMD's FSR above 1.0, meaning FSR is basically not available, which is bad news for a card that's already struggling. What they do have going for them is price. A 2GB GTX 660 Ti like this one can be had for just 15 Great British Pounds from CEX here in the UK. That's around $20 US. What you get for that price is a GPU that can run many of today's esports titles very well, for now, and can rip through some older AAA titles. Like, a bit old. Okay then. Really old. The GTX 660 Ti has 1,344 cores, 112 TMUs, 24 ROPs, and this one has 2GB of GDDR5 on a 192-bit memory bus. It's an asymmetric memory configuration with some NVIDIA jiggery pokery to get it to work. What it means is that this card can access 1.5GB of memory at the full memory bandwidth, while the last 512 megabytes are accessed, well, at a far more leisurely pace. Running in a contemporary system, let's focus on what the 660 Ti can do in 2025. Borderlands 2 was used by NVIDIA to highlight the features and power of the GTX 660 Ti, claiming it could run the game on max settings, and they weren't lying, which makes a change.
With the Blackwell family RTX 5070, 4090 performance.
At 1080p with ultra-high settings and PhysX on low, we get an average frame rate of 103.4 FPS, a 1% low of 74.1 FPS, and a 0.1% low of 56.7 FPS. You're good for 60 FPS max settings in Borderlands 2 on the 660 Ti. Running GTA 5 at 1080p normal with ×4 MSAA, just to prevent it hitting the frame rate limit, is good for an average frame rate of 67.5 FPS, while the 1% low is 43.1 FPS and the 0.1% low is 38.7 FPS. You've got scope to increase the resolution or detail levels above normal on the 660 Ti. Running The Witcher 3 at 1080p low felt jerky, even though the 660 Ti managed an average frame rate of 40.1 FPS. The 1% low was 30.6 FPS and the 0.1% low was 26.7. So a playable experience, although the jerkiness was off-putting. FSR would have helped, but can't be used on the 660 Ti as it results in a black screen. Great. My favourite esport title, Rocket League, is running at 1080p low and had no problems on the GTX 660 Ti, delivering an average frame rate of 222.1 FPS. The 1% low was 110.2 FPS and the 0.1% low was 49.2 FPS. You can still have a great time in Rocket League on the 660 Ti and even have scope to increase the settings a little and still probably achieve a higher refresh rate experience. On the GTX 660 Ti, Battlefield 1 at 1080p medium had no trouble hitting 60 FPS, with an average frame rate of 61 FPS. The 1% low was 43.6 FPS and the 0.1% low was 37.2. Battlefield 1 was very playable on the 660 Ti, and 1080p medium was spot on for a smooth 60 FPS experience. It's the one you skip forward for, it's Fortnite. The GTX 660 Ti can deliver a high refresh rate experience at 142.6 FPS at 1080p low with Epic View on the performance renderer. The 1% low is 49.5 FPS and the 0.1% low is the usual Fortnite standard with a terrible 7.7 FPS. So yeah, you can have fun in Fortnite with a GTX 660 Ti. PUBG at 1080p low with the GTX 660 Ti gets an average frame rate of a respectable 75.5 FPS. with a 1% low of 48.1 FPS and a 0.1% low of 21.1 FPS. The poor 0.1% lows we've been seeing are probably down to the lack of VRAM on the 660 Ti. However, I think you could have some fun games of PUBG on this card. On the GTX 660 Ti, Assassin's Creed Odyssey at 1080p low is a console-like experience with an average frame rate of 32.8 FPS. The 1% low is a cinematic 24.7 FPS and the 0.1% low is 23.6 FPS. In Assassin's Creed Odyssey, we see the 660 Ti delivering last-gen console-like performance, which really isn't surprising. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the GTX 660 Ti is good for an average frame rate of 36.1 FPS at 1080p low settings. The 1% low is 29.1 FPS and the 0.1% low is 25.9. It would look great on a PAL television at 25 FPS. The GTX 660 Ti delivers another last-gen console-like experience in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which means it is completely playable. Oh, I ran Valorant. Man, those games are long. We all honestly wanted to give up way before the round was over. I also saw some funky Kepler artifacts in Valorant, and you might see artifacts like these in other titles using a Kepler card. Anyway, at 1080p low, the average frame rate was 174.4 FPS. The 1% low was 106.2 FPS and the 0.1% low was 49.8 FPS. The GTX 660 Ti can still deliver a high refresh rate experience in Valorant at 1080p low settings. Counter-Strike 2 is not quite a high refresh rate experience on the GTX 660 Ti, with an average frame rate of 103.6 FPS, and the 1% low was 62.8 FPS. Still, you could lock the frame rate to 60 FPS and have a smooth experience playing Counter-Strike 2 on the 660 Ti. Spiderman Remastered runs surprisingly well on the GTX 660 Ti at 1080p with very low settings, delivering an average frame rate of 44.8 FPS. The 1% low was a not great 20.1 FPS and the 0.1% low was just 15.6 FPS. This looks like a sub-last-gen console-like experience for the GTX 660 Ti with Spiderman Remastered. So is it time to give the GTX 660 Ti a gold watch, say thanks for all the hard work and pack it off to the old GPU home? Well, yes, unless you're looking for a very cheap GPU that can run most esports titles well or relive its glory days with older DX11 games. Just be aware that you may see artifacting in some titles, and no, the card isn't broken, it's just well past its prime. Kepler's time has well and truly passed, which is a shame really, because I've got another 3 cards to look at. Next up is the GTX 670, which also costs 15 Great British pounds. So I'll catch you next time, Rammers!